So thank you all very, very much. I'm very, very glad to be here. So I've been looking forward to this presentation here for some time, largely because I don't get to do many presentations in this day of COVID, but I'm really glad to be here, but also looking forward to this presentation with no small amount of fear and trembling, in the sense that I'm asked to give a retrospective of the legacy that many of you here have created, have fostered, have shepherded, have forged. So thank you to you all for making this possible. It does fall to me to try and present a retrospective of research here at Congaree. And I think Dr. Teresa Thome may be logged on way across the country in Oregon. And she's probably like wincing at my title here, but I have to be that kid if there's a word play to be made. So if it's research at Congaree, it's Conga Research, a retrospective. So thanks, Teresa. So without further ado, jumping ahead, I thought tree rings, if I want to give a little bit of an outline, circular outline or something, but just kind of where are we going to go in the presentation? These are not going to be hard breaks delineated, but sort of a six-part journey here to the presentation. First off, I would like to talk a little bit, the first part of the presentation will really be about a brief overview of the history of Congaree National Park, focused on the research. I'm going to gloss over a lot of the other parts that aren't, very, very important and deserve their own merit, but focusing on the research threads in the story of the park. So origins, research has always been central to Congaree National Park. Generation X and Y, we're really talking the 80s and the 90s. Congaree was kind of in the wilderness. I'll talk about what that means or share some ideas. Generation Z, what happens after the year 2000? Lots of big things happened right around that time. And then I want to stand back a minute and think about some new scopes and dimensions that I have seen since I've been here at Congaree in 2006 and working at the park for a few years before that. Some new dimensions that I don't think we were fully processing in the earlier times of the park. And then share two, one hot off the press, there's a new study on Congaree research that I'm gonna share some teasers to. And then a searchable Cong database project that we're working on with the US Geological Survey. So this is where we're gonna go here over the next 30 minutes-ish. So the contrast on this picture is a little hard to read. Some of you may recognize the color scheme. This is Harry Hampton's book, Woods and Waters and Some Asides, that he published in 1979. And I have a copy Teresa Thome left when she left the park. So I was thumbing through it the other day, and there's some righteous pictures of the park in there and Harry Hampton in this area we all know and love. And I found this in one of the passages in reading through the book. Says, in October 1959 occurred what should have been the big event. The National Park Service arranged for a prime group of biologists, botanists, and kindred spirits gathered from Kentucky to Florida to spend a week in the area studying its value, possibilities, and potentials. So right here, from the 1950s, science is first and foremost in how we've thought about and structured our thinking about the values and the potential of this place that is Congaree National Park. Now, some of you may know in 1963, there was a scoping report released by the National Park Service, but there was actually another report released in 1962 that if I'm connecting the dots right, the 62 report is this visit that Harry Hampton's talking about in 59. Maybe, maybe not, maybe there was something subsequent, but this is a copy of that report. I've been digging through the archives in preparation for this presentation, and it's been fascinating. Like, I should kind of say this with a caveat, in my heart of hearts, I have to kind of stop myself from making this a whole new thesis or a dissertation on history of research and kind of corral myself. But some great documents in our files. I'm not suggesting we try and read this publication here, but the last few lines of this, from 1962, it, meaning the lands that are now the park, offers unusually attractive possibilities for biological field research, particularly for studies of the history and development of floodplain vegetation in relation to physiographic processes. So kind of remember that idea. We're founding Congaree National Park. partly on this promise of research possibility about forests and how this forest works. So here we have a picture, and if we had a larger audience, I suspect one of the folks in this picture would be here. Although I think John Seeley is joining us tonight virtually, hello, John. So this is a picture of some folks gathering around a big tree stump back in the 70s. Some of you may remember. And this is just kind of a benchmark to say that a few years after Harry Hampton's kind of tireless effort, tireless advocacy, the effort was picked up by Jim Elder and John Seeley and others, and led to the founding of Congaree National Park, Congaree Swamp National Monument in 1976. So this is just our kind of statement to preserve and protect for the education, inspiration, and enjoyment of present and future generations, an outstanding example of a near virgin southern hardwood forest situated in the Congaree River floodplain in Richland County, South Carolina. Secretary of the Interior shall permit sport fishing. And remember that fishing, we're going to come back to that a little bit later in the presentation here. So we're formed in 1976. By 1979, we actually get a publication which, to my knowledge, is the oldest kind of meta-analysis. This was a research symposium on a typewriter in 1979, but an original research bibliography. We have this righteous old taped up version. It's really tried to lay out everything we knew about the bird communities, the herpetofauna, and the different biological portions of the park and the geology. Dr. Colhoun there was doing the geology. So we have this document from 1979. Now, a few years later, we're getting more people come to the park. I think we had 500 and something visits in 1980. Very, very small crew, but this picture was taken around 1981 or 82. Yes, I am the kid in the yellow shirt, and that is my grandfather and my brother. So they took us out to the park. When we were visiting them, they lived up in the Whitehall area of St. Andrews in Irmo. So, but in the 1980s and the 1990s, the park is really growing a lot. So we had a lot of expanding visitation and facilities. And the part that's important here to science is we're starting to think more formally about the structure of the park, the administration of the park, and what documents do we need. We're starting to develop what will become our general management plans later on. And those are the plans where we say, well, what do we know about this place? What do we need to know? We're starting to lay the groundwork for management basis for research, not just, gee whiz, what can we learn from this place? What do we need to know? In 1983, also founded the South Atlantic Biosphere Reserve. Again, an asterisk there. We're going to come back to that. 1988, we have major expansion and wilderness designations in the park. And I'm eyeing Mark Kinzer or any of these dates or folks in the room. Set me straight if I've made a mistake. It's not intentional. But then in 1989, something else happened. This happened. So on September 21st, this monster beast of a hurricane, Hugo, sweeps in over South Carolina and caused major, major damage at the park. My understanding is it was still a Cat 1 hurricane when it crossed over the park. I was in high school up in Greenville, and we were out of school for a couple of days that far inland. But this is also in response to this damage, as we had a team come out from the University of Georgia, and this is Dr. Becky Sherritt's behind the tripod, whom we are honoring here tonight. And in my mind, Becky really kind of stepped in after Hurricane Hugo and founded a study which ongoing for 20 plus years. She revisited these same plots every 4 years. They're still out there. I believe Bo Song and some others from Clemson have come out to these plots. But Becky really provided the anchor and I think sort of the critical mass and centerpiece that lived up to that vision from the 1950s and the 1960s, this forest vegetation vision. And in my mind, her research is kind of the core around which lots of other stuff orbited and added. Her research really put Congaree on the map, I think, as a legit place to do world-class long-term ecological research. So I did get to work with Becky. I knew her much later when I was finishing my PhD in the early 2000s, and she was fantastic and still knew all these plots and awesome. So I found this vintage picture after Hugo. So through the 1990s, Becky's work is continuing. We're starting to bring in some more science. There's also been more science from the US Geological Survey and others. They were doing work through the 1980s, the Patterson, 83, doing some of the hydrology and some of these other studies, but not a huge volume of research coming out. That starts to change in the 1990s. We're shifting a little bit more towards increased research. And then this kind of culminated, this was going on across the Park Service, and this culminates around the year 2000 with a program called the Natural Resource Challenge. And this was a program funded at the national level where the National Park Service said, we need good science to manage our parks. And this was really a management call mandate for good science. And the Natural Resource Challenge founded several programs that are kind of ubiquitous in the Park Service today, including our inventory and monitoring networks, our invasive plant management teams, the cooperative ecosystem studies units are coming out about this time. They also anchored a program of national research learning centers. And so the idea here was we're going to have these centers for excellence in the National Park Service. And you can see this is an old brochure here. Science, education, and partnerships are kind of the core for the research learning center model. And staff at the time under Superintendent Martha Bogle, whom some of you may remember, wrote a successful proposal to bring a research learning center to Congaree. And this would become the, well, I'll get to that in just a minute, but just reflecting on the Natural Resource Challenge, this is an old brochure, and they just said, applying good science to resource management is our best hope to maintain and restore the rich natural heritage found in the national parks. So this kind of culminating voice and call for science. And at Congaree, we have the Old Growth Bottomland Forest Research and Education Center. I still say that OGBFREC is one of the best acronyms ever. It's just awesome. So many of you may recognize in the screenshot here, the top picture is our old visitor center, which was replaced shortly thereafter with a new Harry Hampton Visitor Center in 2001. And then you can see where this one in the bottom right is under construction. That's the screen porch now at the dormitory, or what used to be Teresa Thome's office. So the original OGBFREC emphasis areas were going to be environmental change research and research education, GIS technology, and support of Southeast Coast inventory and monitoring parks. And so originally hired an education specialist who was Christina Hulslander. Her husband, Bill Hulslander, was resource manager at the time. Bill also hired Teresa Thome as our first learning center director. I came on board as education coordinator in 2006. And in my mind, that was really a golden era for the learning center kind of becoming what it could. And I attribute a lot of this to Teresa Thome's leadership. She tapped her research networks coming out of her PhD at the University of Georgia, but also went out and found experts whom we needed, or responded to folks saying, hey, can I come study this at your park? And she would roll out the red carpet and make things happen. So absolutely fantastic, great at writing grants, bringing folks in. We got all sorts of projects in the park. I got to be along for the ride, but there was so much done. And this is just a synopsis of some of the types of work that we've done. Now, and I should say here too, the first two bullets here are inventory and monitoring. And our inventory and monitoring program with the National Park Service, today their office is housed in the University of Georgia, and they're collecting data all the time. Water quality, air quality, doing systematic vocal neurons, birds, vegetation, doing all these kind of stock surveys. Then the learning centers were trying to take that at Congaree and push it in some other directions. So for inventory, we did some freshwater mussel work and moth work. These are not typically done by the Inventory and Monitoring Network, but we brought in some researchers to do these because they're important to the park. Also did some separate water quality monitoring of various kinds, but also collaborated with our Inventory and Monitoring Network. We did some long-term research about decadal hurricane impacts. This is Becky Sherritt's work, but also looking at sedimentation. This is about the time John Kupfer and some others were coming to USC and what would, fold into some of these projects. So I'm glossing over like 15 years of work in here, but some short-term work on coarse woody debris. We'll hear from Ellen Wohl tomorrow, but also looking at flooding with John Kupfer and Kimberly Meitzen, whom we'll hear from tonight, as well as today. Ray Torres is also doing some flooding work. some species-specific work. Kate Weeks up at Clemson doing PhD on genetics and occurrence of Carolina bogmint. Also doing some fascinating bat work with Susan Loeb and others looking at Rafinesque's big-eared bat and later the southeastern myotis, trying to understand where do these bats roost and forage and what do they need for habitat. Also working with citizen science. So back into the 1990s, a local group was collecting world-class butterfly count data at the park, and that tradition continued largely under Christina Holtzlander. Teresa Thome picked it up, and today we're still working with the Carolina Butterfly Society. Shout out in virtual land to Dave and Marty Kastner, and appreciation for all of your work with the park as they join others too. So butterfly counts are one example of that. Also looking at specific management activities, invasive species. Karen Vaughn came down from Clemson and looked at how do we best kill Chinese privet in the park. There's some options because it doesn't lose its leaves like a lot of the deciduous trees. And so she thought, hey, if we put up some mist blowers out there, can we blow herbicide on it in leaf off season and see if it works? So this is the sort of research that's going on. And the last one is not last for a reason. We're going to come around to it. But then we also started to get some social science. So now Dr. Janae Davis came out and was working with the local fishing traditions, trying to look at how do people interact with this landscape and she came to some very constructively critical, but very critical realities about how Park Service management has impacted local fishing traditions and how, those intergenerational traditions in the African-American community right around the park have been impacted by this. And this kind of brings us full circle to where I want to go next. Because if you notice, everything from 1959 up through was very focused on the natural world in large part. And the big revolution that I see kind of coming over the last 20 years is a recognition that it's a lot more than just nature. So a couple ways to think about that. And this was a picture per Janae's thesis. These were some folks out fishing. We had artists in the parks, Tarpley's come out about 2013, 14, somewhere in there. Well, this one's 14. And there are still local fishing traditions. And if you think back to our enabling legislation, fishing is one of those things that we are mandated to provide access to. It is the only shall provision in our legislation. So if we're not serving the fishing community, we're not serving our legislation. So this is kind of bringing that management and human connections back full circle to the park. It's not just a cool watershed, it actually has meaning. So if we look at, when you go out in the park and you look here, you find things in the leaves. You're not looking for a copperhead, but there's a brick in there. And I took this picture because I tripped over the brick. And I thought, wow, that's kind of cool. But this is just an idea that people have been a part of this landscape for let's just say a very long time. So this is an excerpt from Mark Kinzer here, his book, Nature's Return. And this just shows you that even though the Beidler Tract, we have some core areas that are old growth, there are lots of sites where we know we had, in many cases, very significant disturbance of the forest. So when we think about old growth forest, it's not just ecologically speaking that it's pristine, it's never been clear cut, but it hasn't escaped human impact directly, historically. And today we look at climate change, we look at invasive species. Those are indirect human impacts as well. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Elizabeth Almley. Says, the strength of the human history in the Congaree swamp is not only the physical built remnants of past activity, but the whole long, deep, rich, valued, and even unmarked history of the landscape of a place that is at once both natural and cultural. That's just poetry to me. I don't know. That's just my Congaree. I don't know if that's Congaree geek out or what, but that's just poetry. So when I came through K-12, undergraduate, and even in early graduate career, I was trained as an earth system scientist. And at that time, we taught earth system science as 4 basic spheres: the atmosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere. And they interact. And sometimes you have the cryosphere if you're talking about ice and, people are in there. No. Well, even 10 years ago, that model was kind of out the window and it looks like this. where we added this anthroposphere, which is, anthropos is Greek for people. So the people sphere, people are part of this system. We never have been separate from it, not as we know it in any way, shape, or form in the last many thousand years. So, in one of the places that I really learned this, when I look back now, hindsight is 2020, but about 2005, I had the great privilege of being in Dr. Graff's fluvial geomorphology course at the University of South Carolina. And I just thought this was cool. We had a textbook, Fluvial Forms and Processes, a new perspective by David Knighton. You open it up and we have equations, it's width to depth ratios, but so much more. It's probabilities for meanders and chaos theory for sediment transport and equations. And the other textbook was Mark Twain's Life on the Mississippi. And Dr. Graff needed us to know that rivers were about human experience. How do humans relate to that river, that story? And that to me was beautiful, that here in a graduate level class, there was a final exam essay question on Mark Twain about the river. And I just thought that was amazing. So yes, that's another where we're here tonight for Dr. Graff too. So, kind of coming out of this, I mentioned that Biosphere Reserve formed in 1983, but by about 2016, we reinvigorated that effort. And the Biosphere program is really meant to integrate protected areas with communities around them to think holistically. And the three pillars of sustainability are, natural resources, kind of cultural resources, and economic viability. So really looking outside of the park to think about these as being all interrelated. And this kind of culminates last year. We completed a project called a resource stewardship strategy, which is an internal planning process. So we had folks from multiple parks, from our Washington office, from our regional office, and we sit down and we try and come up with all these lists. What's important about the park? What are your key threats and stressors? What are your key assets in dealing with these? And one of the things they asked us to do was to look at what are our priority resources. And the guidance we were given is what we see here. A priority resource is a cultural or natural resource or value that the National Park Service manages or monitors to maintain a park unit's purpose and significance. That's actually like there's some legal policy level to that language. That's not just somebody spouting off an idea. And so we started talking through things, and I said, yeah, we got this learning center, we got this Biosphere Reserve, and we got all these great partners. And they go, yeah, that's how you get things done. I'm like, no, it's not. That's one of our resources. And so in our group, we made a full court press to actually call and focusing on, the idea that our research partners, you here, are a value that the National Park Service manages or monitors. I'm going to lean on the monitors, works with, collaborates. We don't manage the partnerships per se, but we maintain the park unit's purpose and significance only in direct relationship with you all. That you all are a resource at Congaree National Park, no different than the trees or the water. So this human connection comes full circle, and they bought it. And this was unprecedented. We are the first park in the National Park Service to have cooperative conservation partnerships as a key resource, not a means to an end. And that's something I'm proud to be on that team. Yes, John's given me a heads up here. So, and this includes our learning center, our biosphere region, and we know we still need to do more work to reach out to many of our tribal partners. We're working on that right now, but working with our Congaree Biosphere region, with CERCO, with Central Midlands Midlands Council of Governments and others to think about these issues that are larger than the park and really kind of complete that trifecta. It's not just natural resources, it's not just cultural resources, but there's also the social science. And from ecosystem services to visitor impacts on studies. I want to shift into kind of the last two phases here, and I'm not expecting folks to read this, but this is a way cool article hot off the press. A few years ago, the National Park Service had some money, and we asked some folks at North Carolina State to help go into our research files and make us a map of where researchers have been. And I have to own the fact that they are not here talking tonight. I did not get ahead of the curve to have them at this conference, but I hope if you are out there in research in the virtual presentation that you all will be here for our next research symposium to talk more about this. I don't want to steal thunder, but they took this to a whole nother level. They did not just make a map. They analyzed our research publication trends. So without stealing their thunder, I just want to show you two or three cool graphs. So one of these graphs, they have a big circle diagram here, just showing how they categorized the publications that they found. Now they focused on peer-reviewed journal articles. Well, I'm going to come back. We're going to widen that circle in a minute, but you can see how these publications really, really tick up. So in the 1970s, not much. 80s and 90s, they start to grow. Remember, 2000 is right when our Natural Resource Challenge gets fully funded. Our visitor center goes in 2001. And for those of you in this room or out in virtual land that have ever done research studies take a couple years to happen, right? Look at what happens to the research volume after 2003. It basically goes up 400% in the last 20 years as opposed to what happened in the previous 25. That's pretty impressive. So this is a way cool study. And then they actually did make some maps. So we can see there's some heat maps here from all the survey plots they could find, based on vegetation. A lot of the research has happened up around our visitor center and trail network, which makes sense. It's logistically accessible, as well as some of the work Graham Lockerbie and others working out here by Butterfly Pond and some of these other spots down here doing the one with the soil science. And then all disciplines. We got these heat maps. And I know, John Kupfer, you've done some work out here in Bates Fork. It shows up as a cold spot. There's some work. But the idea is that this research, these maps could be used to maybe guide future research. Which brings us to our last and final piece, and I know I'm clocking in on time. And this is one that's going to be, this is a loading diagram. There's nothing really loading. This is just a GIF, sorry. But we are working with the U.S. Geological Survey on a database for Congaree research publications. And I want to show you a few screenshots. I'm not able to be on live tonight, but I know Matt Pedowick and some others from USGS are online and may be available in the chat for questions, and I'm happy to field questions. Looking to bring this out in February is the hope. We're still kind of checking what's running under the hood, and it has to go through some review. But here's what you see when you click on the website. I took these today, development version, not for public consumption. But there's an annotated bibliography, and if we click down, we can see right now there are 137 publications in this database. Now they've focused on the time range 1996 to present, but not just peer-reviewed journal articles, also dissertations and theses, also technical, like gray literature, technical reports that are in the park archives, et cetera. So we're working on making this interactive. It is not geographically interactive like with a map right now, but we are trying to sort all these by different publication type, et cetera. So if we click on publication type and we go thesis or dissertation, we have 24 different theses and dissertations in the database right now. And you can see them all here, and just kind of clicking on one. This is Janae Davis' work, and it pops up this. So it gives the reference, the publication name, the metadata is what's really hard to track down in detail, as you all know. Study start and end dates, but where we can, live links to available copies. Now, some of these may still be paywalled behind journal articles, but a lot of theses and dissertations are available through different library services. And then some of the publications from the park, maybe contact the park. But the goal for this is researchers that want to come to the park. If you know you need to do something in this part of Cedar Creek, what else has been done around you? Or you want to do something on water quality. Well, there's nothing in that part of the park. That'd be a really cool place to go. So really helping to field these kinds of questions to frame and contextualize studies, or even doing research. If you are a student or you have students that want to, study the park, what might they want to read? They could do this. So this is a teaser, more to come, but we're working on this. So that is my offering for a retrospective of Congaree research, kind of where we've come from, where we are today. And I hope this will set a fair kind of ground for thinking ahead, both on the presentations tonight and in the presentations tomorrow. So thank you all very much. And I don't know, do we have time for one question or? And we'll take those.